Late at night, the dim light of the living room cast a faint golden glow, reflecting the state of Claire Donovan's life. She sat there alone on the worn-out sofa, a half-empty glass of red wine resting in her hand. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder, almost echoing, amplifying the emptiness that engulfed the house. Outside, a fierce wind swept through the trees, rattling the windows, but Claire didn't notice. Her eyes were glued to the glowing screen of Richard's from the device she had stumbled upon on his desk just moments earlier. The screen illuminated a text message that now burned into her memory. "Did you miss me tonight, Richard?" A name lingered beneath it. Sophia. Claire's heart tightened. She read the message again and again, searching desperately for an alternative explanation. But every possibility led to the same painful truth. Her throat went dry, and her hands trembled as she scrolled further into the conversation photos, promises, and even plans for a trip she had never heard about. It was all there, exposing a reality she could no longer deny. The sound of the front door creaking open snapped her back to the present. Claire looked up, startled, as Evan stepped inside. His coat was slung over one shoulder, his youthful face illuminated by the soft light. But his expression was weary. He didn't say a word, only looked at his mother with eyes that seemed to ask, "What's wrong, Mom?" Claire hastily set the phone down on the table, trying to conceal her distress. "Evan, you're home late," she said, her voice rough, as though she had just swallowed a lump in her throat. "I went for a walk," Evan replied, setting his bag down, but his gaze lingered on her face, where the pain was more visible than she realized. "Are you okay? Did something happen?" Claire wanted to say everything was fine. She wanted to smile, to brush off the heaviness in the air that now hung between them, but she couldn't. The images from the phone were seared into her mind, their sharp edges piercing her chest. "I'm fine," she lied, but her tear-filled eyes betrayed her words. Evan stepped closer, lowering himself onto the sofa beside her. "You're not fine. Tell me, Mom, please." Claire shook her head, raising a hand as if to stop him, but the concern in his eyes weakened her resolve. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to let everything spill out to scream that she couldn't bear Richard's betrayal, that she had buried her entire life for a man who no longer loved her. But instead of speaking, she simply sat there, silent, her tears flowing freely. Evan said nothing. He reached out and placed his hand gently on hers, a simple gesture, yet it carried so much comfort. His gaze was tender, but within it lay something deeper, something neither of them dared to name. Claire didn't notice it at first, but in that touch, a seed of something dangerous had been planted. She sat motionless on the sofa, her hands gripping the empty wine glass as if it were the only thing grounding her to reality. Richard's phone lay silent on the table, yet its messages echoed loudly in her mind, each word cutting through her like a blade. She felt like she couldn't breathe, her chest constricted by the suffocating weight of betrayal. How had it come to this? How could the man she once believed in, the one who made her think love was eternal, become such a stranger? So distant, so cruel. Her gaze drifted, almost unconsciously, to the corner of the room, where a large, dust-covered canvas leaned against the wall. It was a painting she had started years ago, never finished. Claire straightened, her tear-filled eyes drawn to it as if it held the key to another life, a time when her world was vibrant, full of color and hope. Back then, Clara was a young woman with bright, eager eyes and a heart brimming with ambition. Art wasn't just her passion. It was her language, her way of connecting with the world in those years. Every stroke of her brush felt like a piece of her soul brought to life, every painting a dream made tangible. Her professors at art school often praised her work, calling it extraordinary, and Claire had believed she was born to create, to live a life of freedom and boundless imagination. Then she met Richard, a young businessman with a confident smile and eyes full of ambition. He was the ideal partner. She thought she needed, steady, strong, someone who could protect her and love her without condition. When Richard proposed, Claire didn't hesitate. She was certain his love would be the flame to fuel her art, propelling her to soar even higher. Those early years with him were like a masterpiece come to life. He adored her, constantly expressing pride in her talent and urging her to follow her dreams. On quiet evenings, he'd watch her paint, sipping his wine and saying, "Claire, the world is going to marvel at you. I'm sure of it." But life wasn't a painting Claire could control. After Evan was born, everything began to change. Richard became busier with work, and his words of encouragement grew fewer and far between. CLA poured her energy into caring for Evan, convincing herself that she was doing the right thing, that this was her duty as a mother. Her brushes and canvases were tucked away along with the dreams she had so lovingly nurtured. CLA tried not to let regret seep in. She loved Evan more than anything in the world. He was her light, her one solace during those weary days. Her little boy, with his wide innocent eyes, would often sit beside her while she painted, watching in fascination. "Draw me, Mom," Evan would plead, and CLA would oblige, capturing his cherubic face on the canvas. She clung to those fleeting moments, those small fragments of her passion. But eventually, even those paintings were left unfinished. Her marriage to Richard transformed in ways she never imagined. He became a shadow, always absent, and even when he was physically present, it was as though he wasn't really there. Claire often asked herself if she had made a mistake, if sacrificing everything for her family had been the wrong choice, or had she simply placed her trust in the wrong person. The answers always eluded her, but the sadness lingered, a constant companion. Now, back in the present, CLA's eyes remained fixed on the dust-covered painting in the corner, as if it contained all her unspoken pain and unfulfilled dreams. Tears streamed down her face, unchecked and unstoppable. She didn't hear Evan enter the room until his voice broke the silence. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his face etched with concern as he came closer. CLA turned to look at him, her son, who was no longer a boy but a man. His face bore traces of the child she once drew. His eyes, so much like her own, reflected not just worrying, but a mirror of herself, of everything she had been and everything she had longed for. For a moment, CLA didn't respond. She couldn't. The weight of years of choices, of dreams abandoned, and betrayals endured pressed down on her. Evan stepped closer, his presence grounding her, his worrying piercing through the haze of her thoughts. And in his gaze, she saw something more than concern, something she couldn't quite name, something that made her heart ache and her breath catch. Evan sat across from Claire at the kitchen table, the light from the chandelier casting soft shadows on her worried face. The dinner plate sat untouched, the food long gone cold. CLA hadn't been able to stomach a single bite since reading those messages. No matter how hard she tried to mask her emotions, Evan's eyes seemed to pierce right through her, as if he already knew every thought swirling in her mind, even though she hadn't uttered a word. "What's wrong, Mom?" Evan asked, his voice steady yet gentle, carrying an undertone of insistence. "I know you're hiding something. Don't tell me it's nothing. I can see it in your eyes." CLA raised her head, her eyes clouded with tears. She didn't want to say it, didn't want Evan to see her so fragile, but she knew she couldn't keep it from him forever. "It's nothing, sweetheart," she repeated, though her trembling voice betrayed her. Evan placed his hands flat on the table, his gaze unwavering and filled with a patience that somehow felt unyielding. "It's about Dad, isn't it?" His question struck her like a blade. Claire turned her head away, unable to meet his eyes, but Evan didn't let up. "I've noticed he's different," he continued, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "You think I don't see it. He doesn't care about you, about us, not like he used to." CLA sat frozen, her hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles turned white. Evan's words, though softly spoken, were sharp enough to shatter the shell she'd built around herself. "Your father has someone else," she said finally, her voice breaking, each word cutting like a fresh wound. Evan didn't respond immediately. His face flickered with anger for a brief moment before it softened into something far more tender, something filled with compassion. "You don't deserve this, Mom," he said, his voice resolute, his eyes bright with a protective fire. "Dad's wrong. You've given him everything, and he doesn't even see it. I don't understand how he could take you for granted." His words were like a balm against her aching heart, soothing the cold emptiness inside her. CLA couldn't remember the last time anyone told her she deserved to be valued, to be loved. Perhaps it had been years ago before everything with Richard had turned so distant. She looked at Evan, and for a fleeting moment, he felt like the only person left in the world. The only one who truly saw her. That night, after Evan had left the table, CLA stayed behind, staring blankly at Richard's phone on the counter. The messages, the pictures, the plans. They were like shards of glass remnants of a life she had once believed would remain perfect. As the soft glow of the living room lights dimmed, she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. "Mom, you're still awake." Evan's voice came from the doorway. CLA looked up, realizing she'd been sitting there for hours, lost in her turbulent thoughts. Evan stepped into the room, pulling out a chair beside her. He didn't say anything at first, simply reached out and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, a gesture simple yet powerful. "I'm here," he said softly. His eyes filled with a concern that felt almost overwhelming. CLA felt the warmth of his hand, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry in front of someone else. She didn't have to hide anymore, didn't have to put on the brave face she had worn for so long. Evan didn't leave, didn't judge, didn't try to fix anything. He just stayed there, her one constant in a crumbling world. In the days that followed, Claire and Evan spent more time together than ever before. They talked about everything from trivial things like the latest movies Evan had watched to the deeper wounds CLA had hidden away for so long. With Richard's absence becoming the norm, Evan had unknowingly become her greatest source of comfort, the lifeline she hadn't realized she so desperately needed. One evening, as CLA sat flipping through old sketches she'd made years ago, Evan walked into the room holding two steaming mugs of tea. He set one down in front of her and took a seat nearby. The space between them was filled with silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was a silence heavy with understanding and unspoken words. "You told me once that painting helped you find yourself," Evan said quietly, breaking the stillness. "Have you ever thought about going back to it?" CLA looked at him, her eyes reflecting the years of regret and sorrow she had tried so hard to bury. "I think I've forgotten how," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper, a confession laced with both vulnerability and resignation. Evan reached out and gently touched her hand. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't just the bond of a mother and her son. It was something deeper, something neither of them could name, something that blurred the lines they never thought would be crossed. That touch lingered just a little too long. CLA felt the warmth of his skin, a sensation that both comforted and unnerved her. She pulled her hand away quickly, her heart racing. But Evan's gaze remained steady, as though he understood everything she was struggling to hide. That night, as CLA slipped into her room, she felt the weight of something undeniable pressing against her. The boundaries between them had begun to shift, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep them intact. That night, the rain poured relentlessly, each heavy drop pounding against the windows as if trying to tear through the silence that enveloped the house. CLA sat alone in the living room, the dim yellow glow of the lamp casting a faint, weak circle of light around her. The half-empty glass of wine in her hand trembled slightly, but the emptiness within her was far from being quenched. Restlessness had gripped her all day, ever since Evan's gaze brushed over her that morning, a gaze so gentle, yet filled with something she dared not name. She couldn't stop thinking about everything. Rich's messages, Evan's words of comfort, and that fleeting touch from the night before that had lingered far too long. Part of her wanted to flee from it all, to escape the tangled web of emotions closing in on her. Yet, another part of her clung to it, unwilling to let go. The sound of rain outside couldn't drown out the deafening rhythm of her racing heartbeat. A knock on the door cut through her spiraling thoughts. CLA flinched. Rising from the sofa to glance toward the entrance, it was Sophia. She stepped inside with her usual familiarity, her hair damp from the rain. Celia offered a strained smile, trying to hide the turmoil brewing inside her, but Sophia, ever perceptive, quickly sensed that something was amiss. "Celia, are you okay? I've been worried about you," Sophia said, her voice laced with both concern and gentle firmness. Celia invited her to sit, but Sophia's probing eyes didn't leave her face. Within moments, the tension between them snapped as Sophia spoke again, cutting straight to the point. "You're hiding something from me, aren't you?" "Don't say you're not. I can see it all over you." Celia felt as though she was standing in front of a mirror. Every secret she had tried so hard to conceal reflected back at her. "I don't know where to start, Sophia," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Everything feels so out of control." Sophia's gaze didn't waver. "This is about Richard, isn't it? You know he's not being honest with you, don't you?" The question landed like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. Celia felt the air leave the room, her chest tightening painfully. She nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered, "but that's not the worst of it." Sophia froze, surprise flickering across her face. "It's not? Then what is?" Celia opened her mouth to answer, but at that exact moment, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Both women turned to see Evan standing there, his face shadowed under the dim light. His eyes swept over Sophia briefly before settling on Celia. Something flickered in his gaze, a spark Celia couldn't name, but it left her breathless. "Mom, I need to talk to you," Evan said, his voice calm, but weighted with unspoken tension. Sophia glanced between the two of them, her confusion and curiosity evident. "Evan, not now," Celia said quickly, panic rising in her chest as she felt control slipping away, but Evan didn't move. His eyes locked firmly on hers. Sophia stood, her expression clouded with suspicion. "I think I should go," she said, her tone uncertain, resolute. "Celia, we'll talk later." As the door closed behind her, the sound reverberated through the room like a tolling bell. Now only Celia and Evan remained. The air between them was thick and suffocating. Celia looked at her son, a gnawing sensation in her chest, whispering that something irreversible was about to happen. "Mom, I can't do this anymore," Evan said, his voice cracking with both pain and determination. "I can't sit by and watch you suffer like this. Dad doesn't deserve you." "I don't care what anyone says, but he hesitated, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Celia's pulse quicken. "I love you more than a son should ever feel for his mother." Celia staggered back, her breath stolen from her lungs. "Evan, you don't know what you're saying," she whispered, her voice trembling. But his gaze didn't falter. "You feel it too, don't you?" he said, taking a step closer. "I see it in the way you look at me, in the way you let your hand linger when you touch mine. You can't deny it, Mom." She wanted to deny it, to scream that he was wrong, that the emotions swirling between them were a cruel trick of circumstance, but the words wouldn't come. Evan took another step forward, and the space between them shrank to almost nothing. "Mom, I can't go back," he murmured, his eyes smoldering with a heat that seemed to consume her. "I know this is wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you." And then it happened. A heavy silence fell as Evan reached up to gently touch Celia's cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stood frozen, time itself seeming to halt, the warmth of his hand making her shiver. Thunder rumbled outside, a warning from the heavens, but within the room, the boundaries that had once defined them were obliterated. Celia felt as though she were teetering on the edge of a precipice, and instead of turning back, she took one step closer. Celia stood frozen before Evan, her heart feeling as though it had been split in two. His words still echoed in her mind, reverberating like the call of an abyss she couldn't escape. Evan's gaze, soft yet pained, filled with a longing she couldn't bear, made it impossible to breathe. Yet deep within her, a voice of reason screamed that this was wrong, that it could not continue. She took a deep breath, summoning what little strength she had left to pull herself out of the darkness closing in around her. "Evan, we can't do this," CLA whispered, her voice cracking like shards of glass. "I love you, but not like this. You have to understand. This isn't the way to heal all that we've lost." Evan stepped back, his eyes filled with anguish. He knew she was right, but the truth didn't ease the ache or the storm of loss and frustration brewing inside him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "I just want you to be happy. I just want you to know that someone is willing to give everything for you." CLA felt her tears spill over, each drop cutting deeper into her heart. She stepped closer to him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, her eyes tender but resolute. "Evan, you've already done more for me than I could ever ask. You've been there for me when I needed you the most. But this isn't the right path. We'll destroy everything, ourselves, each other, and the future you deserve." Evan stood still, his gaze shimmering as if trying to hold on to her, but after a moment, he nodded and stepped back. They both stood there in the silence, the weight of their emotions pressing down on them as though time itself had paused. The sound of the doorbell shattered the heavy stillness. CLA flinched, wiping her tears quickly as she turned toward the door. Evan bowed his head, saying nothing, and quietly left the room, leaving CLA to face the reality that now awaited her. She opened the door to find Richard standing there, his coat soaked through from the rain. His expression was familiar, distant in a way she hadn't seen before. But this time, CLA felt no sting in her chest. She realized, with startling clarity, that whatever feeling she had once held for him had vanished long ago. "We need to talk," Richard said, his voice heavy, as though he too understood that something irreparable was unfolding. CLA invited him in, but her heart was cold now, her resolve unshaken. She no longer cared for explanations or excuses. She didn't want to confront any more lies. Yet, as Richard sat down, what he said next left her stunned. "I know I've made mistakes," Richard admitted, his usual arrogance stripped away, his eyes devoid of their usual smugness. "I've hurt you, CLA. I wasn't there for you when you needed me. But Sophia, she's not the real issue here. I want to fix this, if you still want to." CLA felt her chest tighten. His words carried a sincerity she hadn't expected, but they came far too late. She realized then that it wasn't Richard's betrayal that had destroyed their family. It was the emptiness, the distance, and the coldness that had silently eroded their relationship for years. "Richard, you're right," CLA replied, her voice so calm it surprised even herself. "But there's nothing left here to fix. We lost it long ago, and we both know it. This isn't Sophia's fault or anyone else's. We've simply gone too far to turn back." Richard sat in silence. He didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply absorbed her words, his shoulders slumping as if a heavy weight had been placed upon them. CLA rose to her feet, a flicker of determination glinting in her eyes. The next morning, CLA left. She walked away from everything: the house, the past, and the dreams she had left unfinished. She took only a small suitcase and an incomplete painting, a reminder of the empty spaces in her life that she would one day fill again. Evan stood by the car as she prepared to leave, his eyes heavy with emotion, but this time, there were no unspoken words between them. He took her hand gently and said, "Mom, you'll be okay." "And so will I," CLA nodded, offering him a soft, bittersweet smile. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but it was the most truthful decision she had ever made. She started the car, glancing at the rearview mirror one last time. Evan's figure grew smaller and smaller, fading into the soft light of dawn. As CLA drove away, leaving everything behind, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Somewhere deep in her heart, she knew this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter she would write on her own terms, no longer a shadow in her own life.